The world we live in today is more connected than ever before, yet these connections bring with them new questions that many are too afraid to ask. Among these questions lies a controversial one. Can Islam, with its deeply rooted traditions and beliefs, coexist with the liberal values of the West? Or are we facing a clash too great to reconcile? For some, Islam represents faith, family and tradition. For others, it symbolises fear, cultural conflict and a system that silences dissent. But what happens when these opposing views collide in Western society? In this documentary, we'll explore the delicate balance between freedom of religion and societal safety. We'll discuss the challenges posed by Islam's integration into Western societies, the fear faced by those wishing to leave the religion, and whether banning Islam entirely is the solution, or if there's another way forward. This is not a video about hate or fear, but about asking the questions others won't and searching for solutions that protects everyone's freedoms. The story of Islam in the West begins with migration. After World War II, the West faced a massive labour shortage, and governments turned to workers from across the globe. Many Muslims arrived in countries like the UK, France and Germany, answering the call to rebuild devastated industries. Muslim migrants brought with them a strong sense of family, hard work and tradition. They became a vital part of rebuilding economies, working in factories, transportation and public services. Over time, their communities grew stronger, shaping the cultural and economic fabric of the West. But integration was not always seamless. While many Muslims adopted aspects of Western life, others prioritised preserving their traditions. This created cultural divides that would later become points of contention. Practices like arranged marriages, gender roles, and differing attitudes toward freedom of speech reveal cracks in the narrative of harmonious integration. One of the most debated issues has been the role of Sharia law. For Muslims, it's a spiritual and moral guide, but critics argue that its influence, especially in areas like marriage, divorce, and family disputes, challenges Western legal systems based on secular values. The question is whether parallel legal frameworks should exist within a single nation. These divides became even more pronounced as Islamic populations grew. Critics argue that many Muslim communities resist integration, instead forming isolated enclaves where Western values, like individual liberty and gender equality, are often at odds with deeply held traditions. For decades, attempts to address these tensions have been met with accusations of intolerance and bigotry. While some see any criticism of Islamic practices as offensive, others argue that open debate is necessary to uphold the West's core principles of free speech and equality. Perhaps the most controversial practices are those that directly conflict with Western ideals. Forced marriages, restrictions on women's freedom, and honour-based violence have drawn widespread condemnation. Yet these issues persist, and critics argue that silence from leaders has allowed them to continue unchecked. At the same time, many argue that Western societies have bent too far to accommodate Islamic practices, sometimes at the expense of their own values. Policies designed to promote multiculturalism are increasingly viewed as concessions that weaken national identities. Should nations uphold their traditions and values or sacrifice them in the name of inclusion? These are the questions dividing communities across the West today. Islam's place in the West is one of both contribution and conflict. It represents a test of whether Western nations can maintain that identity while accommodating diversity, and whether Islam can adapt to thrive in a modern, liberal world. This balancing act will define the years to come. Over the last few decades, Western societies have been part of a grand experiment. Open borders, mass migration, and cultural integration. But what happens when these policies clash with our core values, leaving us vulnerable to practices that threaten the safety, values, and identity of our nations? The result is what we see today, a society in collapse, children abused, violence normalised, and cultural traditions that undermine everything we hold dear. Islam, as practiced by certain communities, brings with it cultural norms that are fundamentally at odds with the values that have made the West great. In this societal experiment, we've witnessed the erosion of traditional family structures, the normalization of violence, and the rise of practices that are deeply incompatible with our legal systems and moral codes. Sharia law, a legal system rooted in theocratic control, is gaining a foothold in our cities, presenting a direct challenge to the rule of law that we've built over centuries. In some neighbourhoods, it's not just a religious practice, it's a parallel system of justice that undermines Western ideals of equality, individual rights, and democracy. As we import these customs, we import the very conditions that will dismantle our society. Open borders have brought not only hard-working immigrants, but also the worst elements of society. Those who abuse the system and bring with them cultural practices that destabilise our communities. Forced marriages, honour-based violence, and the systematic oppression of women are no longer fringe issues. They have become a daily reality in many Western cities. And the left, they've turned a blind eye, too afraid to criticise for fear of being labelled Islamophobic. Across the streets of London, Paris, and Berlin, violent crime has been normalised. Children are stabbed for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Youth gangs, often from immigrant communities, now run rampant, instilling fear in citizens who once felt safe in their own neighbourhoods. Society has allowed this to fester, and it has become so commonplace that we no longer question it. Multiculturalism was supposed to enrich our societies, but in reality, it has created a breeding ground for division. What we have instead is the fragmentation of our culture. We've imported practices that undermine basic human rights, like female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and the refusal to integrate. The political elites and media have bent over backward to protect these communities, but they've failed to protect the very values that made this nation great. Cultural relativism, the idea that all practices should be respected, has failed us. It allowed practices that harm vulnerable people to persist, all in the name of tolerance. But the truth is, when you tolerate the intolerable, you condemn your own society to chaos. It's time to acknowledge that some cultural practices simply don't belong here. Western civilization is at a crossroads. The unchecked rise of Islamic cultural practices, combined with our failure to question them, is tearing apart the fabric of our societies. It's time to recognise that multiculturalism, as we've been sold it, is a failure. If we are to preserve our way of life, we must confront these issues head-on, demanding accountability and reclaiming the values that made us great. For many, leaving Islam is not simply a matter of personal choice, it's a battle for survival. The psychological and social toll of rejecting a deeply ingrained belief system is unimaginable to most. For those who seek to break free, the consequences can be life-altering, as they face severe retribution from their families, their communities, and sometimes even the state. The idea of leaving Islam or adopting a different way of life isn't just a personal decision, it's a life and death struggle. For many, the mental toll of wanting to leave Islam is intense. From a young age, Muslims are indoctrinated into a system where leaving the faith isn't just frowned upon, it's often viewed as an unforgivable betrayal. The very thought of rejecting Islam can trigger feelings of guilt, shame, and fear of eternal damnation. But the emotional strain doesn't end with spiritual doubt. The real pain comes from the social isolation, the alienation from one's community, and the fear of being ostracised or even persecuted. Perhaps the most terrifying consequence for those who want to leave Islam is the fear of family retribution. In many Muslim families, religion is not just a personal belief, it's the core of their identity. A child's rejection of the faith is often seen as a personal betrayal, not just of their family's values, but of the entire community. Families may resort to emotional blackmail, threats of violence, or even social exile to enforce conformity. In extreme cases, individuals have been disowned or worse, as they find themselves forced to choose between their family and their own freedom. The pressure doesn't end with family. In tightly knit Muslim communities, rejection of the faith can lead to complete social isolation. Community members often shun those who question or leave Islam, leading to stigmatisation and social death. This communal shaming can be even more damaging than the fear of family retaliation. In a world where relationships and community are everything, those who leave Islam find themselves with no place to turn. For those who want to leave Islam, there is no safe haven. Many countries that claim to uphold freedom of religion continue to turn a blind eye to the plight of those who face persecution for their beliefs. The legal frameworks in some Western countries may offer protection, but that doesn't extend to social and familial ostracism. People seeking refuge from religious oppression often find themselves battling a society that doesn't understand the depths of their struggle, or worse, that silently condones the persecution they face. The psychological and social challenges faced by those leaving Islam are real, and they are devastating. For those who are brave enough to take the step toward a new life, society must offer more than just words. We need a system that ensures these individuals have a safe haven, a place where they can rebuild their lives free from fear and persecution. Only then can we begin to address the damage done by years of social and religious oppression. As the influence of Islam grows in Western societies, so too do the consequences for social cohesion. What was once a small, isolated community has now become a defining factor in shaping the landscape of our cities, our politics, and our values. But what is the real cost of this transformation? And are we losing the very essence of what made our societies great? In Western societies, the arrival and growing presence of Islam has exposed a deep cultural rift. On one hand, there's a push for diversity and inclusion. On the other, the pressure to preserve Western ideals, individual freedoms, secularism, and gender equality has led to a clash of values. These competing worldviews are not just ideological differences, but have material consequences in everyday life, from workplace policies to public schools and even the legal system. The economic toll of immigration and integration cannot be ignored. While many Muslims contribute positively to the workforce, the strain on social services, healthcare and housing is undeniable. What was once a thriving economy is now burdened with the costs of integration programs, welfare and benefits for new arrivals. As the Muslim population grows, so too does the cost of maintaining this multicultural dream. Along with these cultural and economic strains comes political polarisation. Political parties across the West are divided over how to address the Muslim question. While some champion multiculturalism and diversity as pillars of progress, others argue that the rise of Islam is eroding the foundation of Western values. The division has led to increased radicalisation, both in Muslim communities and among those who fear the loss of their way of life. One of the most alarming aspects of the growing Muslim presence in the West has been the rise of extremism. While the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful, there is a radical minority that seeks to impose their beliefs through violence. The terrorist attacks, the rising number of jihadi cells, and the radicalisation of young people are all symptoms of a deeper issue, a clash between incompatible worldviews that is being ignored by those who refuse to see the danger. The loss of national identity is another casualty in this growing crisis. Western nations that once prided themselves on their unique cultural heritage are now grappling with questions of what it means to be British, French, or American. As the Muslim population grows, so does the pressure to accommodate their values, sometimes at the expense of traditional Western ones. The question arises, how much of our identity are we willing to sacrifice in the name of multiculturalism? As these challenges grow, one thing becomes clear: reform is essential. Western societies must find a way to address the tension between their core values and the demands of multiculturalism. The cost of ignoring these issues is too great. It is time to have honest conversations about the future of Western civilization and the role Islam will play in it. Only by confronting these realities can we hope to preserve the freedoms and values that have made us who we are. The future of the West depends on how we navigate the growing influence of Islam. Do we continue to accommodate practices that undermine our way of life, or do we stand firm in preserving the values that have made us prosperous and free? The answer will determine the future of our societies and whether we can overcome the forces of division and radicalisation that threaten to tear us apart. As we've seen, the challenges Islam presents to Western societies are profound, affecting everything from our legal systems to our cultural identity. But acknowledging these problems is only the first step. The real question is, what can we do to protect our societies, our values, and our way of life while still upholding our principles of freedom and tolerance? The first step toward resolving these issues lies in stronger government policies. Western governments must take a firm stance on immigration, ensuring that newcomers integrate into the cultural, legal and moral fabric of society. This doesn't mean rejecting diversity, but it does mean establishing clear boundaries and expectations for newcomers. Immigrants must adopt the values of their host country, including respect for secularism, gender equality and individual freedoms. Policies that promote forced cultural integration, not just coexistence, are essential to avoid further division. One of the cornerstones of Western civilization is secularism, the separation of religion and state. Governments must ensure that all religious practices align with the laws and values of the state. For Muslims, this means understanding that the legal framework of their host country must come first, ahead of religious law. Secularism must be defended vigorously, especially in public institutions like schools, courts and the workplace. Moreover, gender equality must be non-negotiable. No one, regardless of their religion, should be allowed to practice or promote anything that undermines the rights of women or marginalised groups. Multiculturalism, as we've come to know it, has failed. It has promoted the idea that every culture should exist in a vacuum, creating divisions rather than unity. The solution lies not in multiculturalism, but in cultural integration. Immigrants must not only be expected to respect local customs, they must actively participate in them. This means learning the language, embracing democratic values, and participating in the economy and society. Immigrants should be encouraged to adopt the positive aspects of Western culture while respecting their own heritage in private, not in public spheres that could compromise social harmony. While strong policies are necessary, fostering dialogue and mutual understanding is equally important. We must encourage open conversations about Islam's role in Western societies, not through fear or intolerance, but through honest discussion. By doing so, we can challenge extremists and empower moderate Muslims who seek reform. It's essential to differentiate between Islam as a religion and the political ideologies that some groups use in its name. We need to support the voices of reformers who are calling for change from within the Muslim community and offer them a platform. Finally, we must protect the values and identity that have made the West a beacon of freedom, prosperity and individual rights. This means standing firm against any attempts to erode those values, whether from within or without. The preservation of Western culture, secularism, gender equality, free speech and the rule of law should never be up for negotiation. We must teach future generations the importance of these values, ensuring that they understand why they matter and how to defend them. The media and education system play a pivotal role in shaping public perception. It's time for the media to stop softening the reality of radicalism and start reporting the truth about the growing challenges we face. Similarly, the education system must teach young people the importance of Western values and the dangers of extremism. Schools should offer education that helps students critically examine all ideologies, ensuring they understand the cultural, political and social implications of a society shaped by multiple belief systems. The West faces a defining moment. Do we continue down the path of cultural fragmentation, or do we rise to the challenge of safeguarding our future? The solutions are within our reach, but they require courage, honesty and a firm commitment to our core values. It's time for action. It's time to ensure the future of Western civilization remains in our hands, built upon the pillars that have supported us for centuries. As we look toward the future, the role of Islam in Western societies remains a contentious issue. Will the West succeed in integrating Islamic communities, or will we face deeper division? The next few decades will be pivotal in determining how Islam coexists with the core values of Western civilization. But the path forward is fraught with challenges, and the stakes could not be higher. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the West. With Muslim populations continuing to rise, the challenge of integration grows more urgent. Can the West create an environment where Muslims can thrive without compromising the values that made Western society successful? Or will we see the continued erosion of our traditions and freedoms as the pressure to accommodate Islamic practices mounts? The future of Islam in the West may hinge on the younger generation of Muslims. Many young people raised in Western countries are beginning to question the practices of their elders, and are seeking a balance between their faith and the values of the societies they live in. Will this new generation become the bridge between Islamic traditions and Western ideals, or will they further entrench the divide? One of the most pressing issues is the potential for radicalisation within Muslim communities. While the majority of Muslims in the West reject extremism, there remains a dangerous minority that seeks to impose their interpretation of Islam through violence. However, there is also a growing movement within Islam calling for reform, seeking a more moderate and peaceful approach to faith. The question is, can reformers gain enough ground to push back against the rise of radicalism? Ultimately, the future of Islam in the West will depend on strong leadership. Governments must act decisively to ensure that radical ideologies are not allowed to thrive. At the same time, moderate Muslims must find the courage to challenge the extremists within their communities and work alongside Western leaders to promote integration, unity and peace. Can Islam truly coexist with Western values, or are the two fundamentally incompatible? It's a question that many are unwilling to ask, but it's a question we must confront. The answer will shape the future of our societies. Islam has a place in the West, but only if it can evolve to fit within the framework of democracy, individual rights and secularism. This is the challenge that lies ahead. The future of the West is in our hands. It's time to stand firm on the values that have made our society strong, values of freedom, equality and justice. By facing the challenges of integration head-on, we can ensure that the next generation of Muslims is part of a society that honours these principles, while respecting their faith. It's time to act and to secure a future that is both inclusive and true to our heritage. As the West continues to evolve, we must be vigilant in guarding the freedoms we hold dear. The path ahead is fraught with challenges, but if we confront these issues with courage and resolve, we can build a society where Islam and the West coexist in peace and prosperity. The road ahead may be long, but it starts with the willingness to ask the tough questions and make the hard choices. As we've explored throughout this documentary, the presence of Islam in the West is not just a religious matter. It is a societal, political and cultural phenomenon that continues to shape the future of our nations. From historical migration patterns to present-day tensions, we've seen how this issue has sparked passionate debate across Europe and beyond. The question remains, can Islam truly coexist with Western values, or are we witnessing an irreversible transformation of our societies? Some argue that integration is possible, that Islam, like Christianity and Judaism before it, can adapt to modernity. Others believe that fundamental differences in ideology, governance and social norms make full assimilation unlikely or even impossible. What is undeniable is that the West stands at a crossroads. With rising crime rates, cultural tensions and ideological clashes, ignoring these issues is no longer an option. As citizens, as voters and as individuals, we must ask ourselves, what kind of future do we want for our children? The fate of Western civilization is not written in stone. It will be determined by the choices we make today. The question is, what will we do about it?